Welcome to Dev Live, the podcast where we help you level up so you become the best engineer on your team, or we help you level up so you land your first engineering job. And this is Juan and Jared.
And this is Jared Potter.
And today, Jared, we're going to talk about something that I run into like a couple of weeks ago when I was working with some of my students. We were working with our packages, and some students had some issues and some other students didn't have the issue. And the issue was because they were not doing a proper dependency management. So their dependency management practices were not great. And we corrected them, right? So this episode is dedicated to these. We're going to talk about best practices for managing your dependencies. Specifically, we're gonna talk about Npm and Yarn, just Npm packages, JavaScript packages, right? Since this is like JavaScript world here, and I think that's that's what we're gonna cover. So so let's get started, Jared. Let's start with let's start like talking about like why even packages? Like why do we even need packages when we build JavaScript applications? Like why package managers? Why even bother about that?
Definitely. No, I think that's a great place for us to start. So yeah, just to give people who are out there listening a little bit of a baseline of where we're going to be starting. You know, when normally when you're building your applications, you write all your own code to build your applications. However, it doesn't have to be that way. Just like in many other languages, JavaScript has a very healthy package registry marketplace out there for you to be able to install other people's packages into your projects and then leverage their work. The phrase I like to use is standing on the shoulder of giants. And the idea here is that the giants is the accumulation of work of lots and lots of people, thousands of people, to ultimately create all the different packages that we use every day, right? It makes us more efficient software engineers.
Yeah. And one of the things, like I was just thinking few years back, let's say 2014, 2013, we didn't like really use NPM or package managers like in JavaScript like we do today. We would have maybe something called Bower at the time, or maybe Grunt to run tasks. Like, I don't know if you remember back in the day, you probably have heard about those. I had to use them a lot. And, but the ecosystem wasn't great. There was no like decentralized way to do certain things. So you had to do like, maybe I'll do Bower, other projects would do something different. So the problem really is that instead of having to like go, maybe sometimes you would go and grab a package and copy that script and put it in your project, right? But the thing like then it gets stale, then maybe somebody else gets the copy, your project gets too big, right? So that the first thing I want to talk about is like the first best practice when managing dependencies, right? And when building JavaScript projects is that you want to pick a package manager. And the reason is so then you don't have to include that code base in your project. So package managers, Jared, the most popular is Npm, right? They come with Node. It's like it comes installed with Node, but there's other alternatives. So the other alternative that is very popular is Yarn. That was created by Facebook. So let's talk about that one, Jared. Like Npm and Yarn, like when to pick one or the other. What are the differences? Like why do we even have two choices?
Definitely. One distinction I want to provide for our listeners up front here is there's a distinction between NPM as a CLI tool that's installed on your computer when you install Node, like Juan said. And then there's this separate part of NPM, which is the NPM registry, right? Which is where all public repositories are hosted that you install from, right? So what we're going to be talking about right here is the CLI NPM tool, as well as Yarn, right? Just so everyone knows, Yarn, when we run Yarn install, it still is going to the NPM registry to get its public packages to be installed. But yeah, so why is there two methods? Well, the first method came out, NPM, because there was a necessity to build packages and to have versioning, like Juan said. When you initially create a project, you're going to have a package.json file that describes the list of dependencies for your package. And when you run npm install, as you know, it goes ahead and installs those. So then the distinction is, why is there something else like this other thing called Yarn? So there's a few specific reasons why Yarn came about and why it exists. One is purely just for speed and performance. NPM, when you run npm install, will install packages sequentially, one at a time, whereas Yarn was built from the ground up to be a parallel install. So it's going to go out and fetch all the packages simultaneously, or at least mostly simultaneously, to make sure that they all get downloaded. And there's direct performance enhancements from that process. But I'm curious to know, Juan, what are some of the other benefits of
Yeah.
using Yarn over NPM?
Yeah, so one of the reasons, like many people say, like, "Hey, I want to use Yarn," is because they have the sense that Yarn is faster, and I'm among that group of people. And the reason why Yarn is faster is because Yarn, like Facebook, has its own mirror set of servers that mirror the packages from npm, but have their own dependency solving strategies. So usually when you install a package and the packages are built for your machine, because that's how it works, some packages are just built on your machine for your system, Yarn just tends to be faster. And also the mirroring, the servers are available and faster also. NPM has invested a lot in that. One of the reasons back in the day when Yarn came out was that Yarn introduced the log file. So then you could log dependencies, and we're going to cover that in our practices. NPM has one now. It's been a few years since they did, but they didn't have one in the past. So that's why like it's good to have choices. But one best practices is once you pick one, right? Once you pick your package manager, if it is npm or Yarn, you stick with that. Don't manage the two of them or don't mix them. Use the two because they build modules differently. They have the different caches and they create the different log files. So now that we let's say we picked one of the package managers, right? Let's say we picked npm or Yarn, right? Let's talk about dependency management best practices. Like I have my project, I have npm or I have Yarn. Then what would be the next natural thing to keep in mind to keep clean package management best practices, dependency management best practices?
Yeah, definitely. I think another really great tip would be to understanding the distinction between a dev dependency and a normal dependency. So I'll go ahead and just give a stab at kind of explaining what those are. So a dev dependency is going to be a dependency that you only need when you are developing that, that piece of software, that package, whatever it be. However, when you go to like essentially build that project to be ready for a production environment, you do not want to include some of these. So Juan, what are some examples of dev dependencies that you would install in your project that are useful for you as an engineer, but not useful for when you've deployed your application?
Yeah, perfect. So no, that's great. So yeah, keep that distinction between development dependencies and production dependencies, right? So for that, when you install, right, when you install a dependency, you use usually the -d, right, or --dev, depending if you're using npm or Yarn. Look at the documentation. But when you install a package, you define, by default, it's going to be a production dependency, I think, depending on the package manager. But if you want it to be a dev dependency, you do the --dev. Both dependencies are going to be included in your package.json. We're going to talk about the package.json next. But the difference to cover your question, Jared, to answer that, is that for example, a unit testing framework. Let's say I have my project, I'm doing unit testing, I'm doing code coverage, I'm doing code analysis, I'm compiling, I have Webpack. I don't need to package any of that in my final bundle that I'm gonna serve for my production application. So that's why it's good to have that distinction, because then when you build your package, you can just say npm install production --production, for example, and that's going to install just the production dependencies. Then you can do your packaging and your bundle, and everything's going to be used. Depends on your specific build pipeline, right? But in theory, it's going to be lighter, right? Because you know that when you install a package, you potentially are installing like another 10 or 100 that are dependencies to that package that you have. So it's going to keep things lightweight. It's going to keep things faster. Of course, if you have module bundling and stuff like that, tree shaking, that's going to help, but it's just a clean practice to have that clear distinction is starting from the development team. So you know, like, okay, this is just using dev, I can change the version, no risk, right? So it's also self-documenting to keep that distinction, what's exclusively used in production and what's sharing production and dev, or exclusive in dev, right? So that, yeah, read everything you can about dev dependencies and more about it, but that's a really good practice to keep in mind. Keep them separate. Don't default to production dependencies.
Yeah, no, you nailed it. Go ahead, Juan.
Perfect. So now that like we were talking about like the package.json, right? That's the next natural thing. When you create a project, right? ideally you want to initialize the project, right? So Jared, you tell us about it. I saw your tweet like a few weeks ago or a month ago, I don't remember. You showed some tricks about initializing the npm project, right? So let's talk about it. Like, why initialize a project? Why have a package.json? Because we don't really have to, right? We can just do global dependencies. So we're going to talk about that too. But why the package.json, Jared? And how do we create one?
Yeah, definitely. So I'll start from the beginning there. So to take one of your, an application, a web application or a server application written in JavaScript and turn it into an npm package that allows you to then manage dependencies, you're going to run npm space init space, just npm init, and you just run that. And then it's going to take you through a command line interface to kind of select some additional options. There is a shortcut of -yes or even just -y for the shortcut that will just assume certain defaults based on the naming of the folder. But if you wanted to actually fill it all out and make sure it's detailed, then you're going to run just npm init and it will take you that process. So the reason why you're doing this, and Juan had alluded to it earlier, is one is that it's going to keep all your packages organized within that project. And no matter who pulls this project down from GitHub and runs it, when they run npm install, it's going to go through that list of dependencies and install all of them to ensure that that other person's machine can then run your software. If you have things installed globally, then it's kind of messy because you then have to go to your README and add these details of like, oh, install this package globally on your command line, when you don't really need to do that. And it's just more inefficient to do that. You want someone to be able to clone your code, npm install, npm run start, and be going, essentially, right? You might have an environment file that you have to add or something like that, but that's kind of why you're doing that. And again, you're also, when you use this package.json, you're getting the benefit of the versions of those packages that you're installing and getting control over them. If you just, went and downloaded a package off the internet, the actual raw JavaScript file, and then included it in your package, like Juan was saying, your package is going to get stale. And also, when you want to upgrade it, you have to go to the website, download a new copy, save it manually. Whereas within a package.json, you could just change the numbers as necessary, run npm install, and it will get you in good shape.
Exactly. And the way I like to put it there is that, well, one thing to clarify, of course, package.json is the source of truth for both package managers. Npm and Yarn, they both use the same package.json, but that doesn't mean you should be combining the two of them. Pick one and that you use it forever with that project. You're going to keep things simple. Don't try to combine them. Don't tell the development team, you can use whatever you want, right? Because if not, you're going to have to keep track of other things like two log files, and it's not recommended, okay? Because they potentially can get out of sync and that could be problematic. Also, the way they build dependencies could be problematic too. One of the things that is important to distinguish is like the fact that we have the next natural step. We have a package.json file. This is a manifest. This is just really describing, hey, this is everything the application needs to run in dev and in production. And these are the scripts, because the package.json has a set of scripts that you can describe some things that you can run. So it's very self-documenting. So it's a manifest that describes how your application, the dependencies of your application, what it needs, and how it can be run through the scripts. Two things that you mentioned, Jared, one thing versioning and one thing global dependencies. So best practice, do not install global dependencies unless it's a global CLI. For example, let's say I'm working on a project in Vue and I install the Vue CLI or I install the Angular CLI. It's okay to install those globally, right? So then you can create projects in any place, or Firebase CLI, right? You can run them, but when you have a project, you limit that, like that's it. You don't do more CLIs, like even the Webpack CLI or the Jasmine CLI or Jest CLIs, you install them, like you have them in the package.json. And the reason for that is because just think about it this way. Every time you look at the package of JSON, if the package is not there, it does not exist in the project. We think as developers, especially growing engineering teams, is not there, it does not exist. So students struggle a lot with this because they think like sometimes they install globally or they install and they don't save it in the package.json, and then other student runs it and it's like, oh no, don't forget, when you clone the project, you have to run these npm install certain packages, like, and it's kind of like you're adding more work and manual steps when it could be all inclusive with the package.json. So don't install global dependencies for the specific projects. Have everything defined in the project, including the CLIs, except like just evaluate case by case. If it is a global CLI important, like a Firebase CLI or stuff like that, that you want to create projects from scratch, it's okay. But just really like the only CLI you should have should be the Yarn and the NPM CLI. Other than that, you don't really need any other CLI. Everything can be just local to the project. And that ensures that different developers have the very same versions, right? And we're going to talk more about version management there. But yes, Jared, you want to add something to this?
Yeah, just one small bit is one common issue that I've seen students run into. So a lot of my students use these exorcism.io, this website for doing little coding challenges. And how it works is you clone down this, this repository, and then you need to install it and then run it to be able to see the tests run, whether or not they pass or fail. Well, a common mistake that I saw my students make was that when they forgot to run npm install. So when it went to go run the testing frameworks, it was saying like, command not found for Jasmine or whatever testing framework it was. So just remember out there that, if you're having an issue where it says command not found, and it has to do with some sort of testing framework, chances are you just forgot to run npm install. So
yeah,
it's a common mistake I saw students make.
Oh yeah, when you have the issue like it works on my computer. So we're gonna talk about that. It works on my computer, common issue, right? Like it works in my machine, it doesn't work in production. But let's take a break now. I'm gonna go ahead and share our Twitter account. So if you wanna get in touch, you wanna follow us on Twitter. So here we have Jared's Twitter, and we have a big follow button.
Yep. And everybody can follow me at twitter.com/Jared Potter. That's JaredPotter. And feel free to reach out and say hello.
Yeah, we're posting content every week. We post tweets about what we talk. We share the episodes. Like we just tweet about whatever if we feel like. And me, yeah, you can follow me also on Twitter. So twitter.com /JUANLIZARAZOG. So I'm going to repeat that because I messed up. JUANLIZARAZOG. But to make it simple, we included the links on every episode. We include the links to our Twitter, so you can just click and follow. If you don't have Twitter, then whatever platform you're listening this on or watching this on, YouTube or Spotify, Apple Podcasts, just follow us there so you get notified every time we publish content. Usually we're publishing a new episode every week, and everything is targeted for the new software engineers, aspiring software engineers, because remember, we're trying to close that gap after graduation and landing your first engineering job, because when you graduate, you are not ready. So we're trying to close that gap. So reach out, and maybe you want us to talk about a topic, just tweet about it. Let us know. Awesome. So now continuing, Jared, let's talk about dependency management best practices, like the versioning part. When it comes to versioning, if you install a package, usually it's going to include like that caret that is kind of like that. I mean, I don't know how the name of that
pointer.
Yeah, it's like that little triangle pointer thing right before the version. So one of the things that I want you to listen to, your listeners out there, I want you to Google and learn everything about it. Semantic versioning. I'm not going to explain it right now because it's not really like the core of this discussion today, but semantic versioning. So for semantic versioning, right, that caret just means that it's going to install any minor or any patch version. But the problem with that is that if you don't have a locking mechanism, a log file, then when somebody else installs the project, they might get a newer or different version. And usually when you have a mismatch between versions, sometimes even minor patches could have different bugs or could have bug fixes, and then the application behaves differently. So the best practice that I recommend is that when you install your packages, use the --exact command. So installs the exact command, or you can configure your package manager with a global setting like npm set global --exact, something like that. Google the documentation and you will find the exact syntax. Same for Yarn, but you can default to install exact version. So this is on purpose. Never use latest. Like you can do add latest. Never do latest, because latest is a bad practice. Always log to a specific version. Ideally, you want to delete that caret, or if you have the little curvy tilde, right, that just means that any major patch. Also, I remove it because sometimes between patches, new patches introduce bugs, or sometimes like I have had the experience that it has broken my projects or projects for my team members that we just log to exact versions. And then as part of this, include a log file. So the log file is auto-generated. You include it in your Git repository, in your version control, if you're not using Git, and that will log to, because one important part is when you install a package, Jared, you know that, like, let's say I install a package, most of the times that package has another 10 dependencies under the hood that are invisible to me. So the package log is going to make sure that at least it's going to take a snapshot of the current versions to log to that specific snapshot so everybody gets the very same versions. And the reason for this is because, let's say you're deploying today, you build the code today and you deploy tomorrow, but maybe tonight a new version came out, right, of whatever dependency you have, and you deploy tomorrow and the deployment breaks. That has happened a lot before. So then having this log is going to ensure that those intermediate dependencies that are not part of your project, but your project is pulling, are going to be logged to a specific version. So research everything you can about package.log.json or the yarn.log. Only include one on your project, not the two. So you enforce your team to tell your team, hey, we're using use yarn forever. We're using npm, use npm forever. If they want to use one or the other, it's not official because you can run into issues because they build differently. And that's really like gonna make sure that your project is gonna be always stable and run under the same conditions in different environments. So Jared, what do you think about this versioning management?
Yeah, no, I completely agree. Yeah, like Juan was saying, I just want to emphasize that when you run the npm install, if you're using npm, it's going to create that package-lock.json file, whereas if you were using yarn, it's going to create that yarn.lock. And they're fulfilling a similar, I mean, pretty much the same role, but there's distinctions. I know the difference between them. But yeah, whichever one you pick, you stick with, and then this is a file that you will commit to your Git repository. And I think that brings us into kind of another topic to make sure that we're covering here is things that you should or shouldn't be committing to your Git repository in regards to packaging. Okay, so your package.json, you definitely want to commit that to your repository. Once you have a package lock JSON or the yarn lock, if you're using yarn lock, that is also something that you are going to commit into your repository. But when we install these packages, when we run npm install or yarn install, what happens is all these packages get saved to a particular folder in your directory, and that folder is called your node_modules folder. If you ever accidentally click on the little expander, your IDE probably spreads vertically a lot because of all the long list of dependencies and the dependencies of your dependencies, right, and all the way down. But this folder ends up being quite large, sometimes hundreds of megabytes in size for all the code that needs to be inside of there. And we don't want to be publishing this to our repository. So Juan, how do we go about managing this node modules file? How do we prevent it from being uploaded?
Yeah, so yeah, definitely. Either if you use yarn or npm, that's going to generate a node_modules folder, and you want to never include that in Git because it's too many files, too big, right? Too hard to track. I mean, you don't want to track somebody else's changes, right? These other projects. So what you do is if you're using Git, I'm going to talk about Git because that's very popular today, right? And Git, remember, Git is the platform. It's just like Git is the system, the platform or the UI management for Git. Like if it is GitHub, GitLab, Bitbucket, Assembler, whatever you're using, there's so many, but all of them use Git. So but if you're using something that is not Git, figure out how to exclude files on your specific version control system. But for Git, you create a .gitignore file, and every project should have this. So as soon as you create the project the first time and you put it into Git, create a .gitignore file. Usually the things you want to include there, like folders generated by your IDE, maybe the .visual code or the .code folder, I don't remember the name, .idea if you're using JetBrains, node modules, right? Node_modules / right, to exclude the folder. Typing just node_module will exclude the folder, but you want to do it before you do the commit. Let's say you did a commit and you included all the node modules and you add Git, right? The Git ignore, and you exclude it after the fact. Too late at that point, it's already in version control. So ideally you want to delete it first, then add it to version control, and then then add the Git ignore to version control at that line, and then do the npm install and make sure that is not in your dependency in your version control management system. Like let's say go to github.com, make sure it's not there, because if it is there, then make sure to delete it. There's different strategies to delete already tracked files. I'm not going to talk about that, but the easiest way is just delete it, commit, right? Delete from the git ignore, delete the folder, commit, then add it to the git ignore, then do the npm install, and then try, right? Like that's one easy way that I usually do it when I mess up, but there's other ways you can do a cat. I'm not going to talk about that, but yeah, no, that's very important that you shouldn't track. And also that you have the package.json, let's say you're tracking package.json, then exclude yarn.log. If you're tracking yarn.log, exclude package.json. And this is on purpose, so then if other team members use it, they're not going to check it in by accident. So you just want to stick with one or the other. If you're using today, in 2020, you're using npm 6.9 or something like that, I think is the latest version or around that. It's really good. It's really fast, and it has improved so much since Yarn came out. So right today, there's not really a very strong reason to say like Yarn is better or not. Like, I mean, I still like Yarn better. Like, that's preference, and the team will decide. I love Yarn. It's super fast when building the modules. That's just my opinion, but npm is really good too. Something very important that I was just thinking with the package.json, we have the scripts section. So I would say, always take advantage of that, right? Look into the script section and create scripts that helps you build the project, test the project. So you don't have to be like writing down scripts in the README and have the team memorize them. The team can always open the package.json and see like, oh, I can do tests, right? For example, test is a native one. You just run npm test or yarn test, and it will run automatically the test if it is defined. So you just fill out the script, but keep that in mind. But yeah, I mean, like, yeah, that's very good. I think we had good coverage there on that, Jared. I would say let's move to another best practice with dependency management.
Yeah, one thing I want to add, and this goes back to our first question, was about kind of what are the distinctions between npm and yarn. So one of the most prominent ones being the parallel install. Again, so it installs faster than npm in most cases. But the other major difference that Yarn has is it's a bit stricter and more consistent with how it manages versions of different files. And, you know, like Juan was saying earlier, go and read more about the semantic versioning and how perhaps Yarn does it differently than npm. But Yarn kind of came about with this stricter versioning of for their packages because there were issues where everybody who was publishing packages didn't strictly follow semantic versioning, and then they were publishing breaking changes or behavioral changes in their packages, but not, you know, doing it as part of a major change, right? Or not doing it part of a minor change in the specific cases. So that was kind of the other reason why Yarn kind of came about. It wasn't just for performance reasons, but also to help minimize the surface area of issues or bugs. But Juan, have you had experiences with that in your work?
Yeah, like sometimes, like for example, the other day we were using a package to do migrations with my students, and we did npm to run Postgres migrations. I think the package was Postgrader. We would run the command npm run migrate. Nothing would happen, no error. It would say like starting, and it would just stop, no error, no log. We tried the rows, nothing worked. And then we tried with Yarn, same issue, but then we uninstall the packages, like delete non-modules, install again just with Yarn build them, and it just worked with Yarn. So we didn't have the bug with Yarn. So some bug with npm or with the package, something going on. We didn't know what it was, but it was like, hey, Yarn is working with Yarn. Other instances, let's say the npm, you know, Yarn, think of Yarn as a mirror. So if you publish to npm, Yarn is going to grab a copy into their own registry. You don't really publish directly to Yarn. You publish to npm, and npm will grab that. And yeah, it's available for Yarn. So it's a mirror, but the mirror is faster, right? So sometimes I have looked when npm was down at some point, right? And I was like, oh, npm is down. Well, I have Yarn. Let's do Yarn install. And I was able to install my package because I had other options, and that was like years back, but it's still like it's good to have those options. But yeah, we don't want to tell you like use one or the other, depending on the team, right? Both are good. I have projects that I use npm, I have projects that I use Yarn, and it's more about like when the project was established, whoever picked, or the team, right, they picked npm, we just stick with that and we just continue using npm. Works great. But if it was Yarn, then it's still there, right? So it's good to learn about the differences on the commands and the nuances and the management, right? But yeah, talking about other practices, let's couple like just high level some other practices. Depending on the package manager that you use, I would recommend that you look into utility scripts that they have built in. For example, two that I use a lot, npm outdated, for example. That one will list all the outdated packages. So then you know, like, well, this version is like 5 years old. Maybe I should upgrade to a newer version. Or if not, there's no newer version, maybe you want to replace the package. That's one thing that I use a lot. npm audit, right, to check vulnerabilities, and that will tell you, hey, you should upgrade to this. Because if there's a vulnerability in your software is as good as your dependencies, right? So if you have a vulnerability in your dependencies, you potentially have vulnerabilities in your own software, right? So you want to make sure to keep track of of that security, like to build high performance teams, you want security built in your software development process. So that's something that at some point we'll talk about that, Jared, but like it's very important to keep those things in mind. And one last thing I want to mention, and then Jared, if you have more practices, we can also cover them. But the last practice I want to mention regarding the package management is that when you have the so when you're installing your packages, right? When you pick your dependency manager, you learn like the description stuff, the documentation, but you want to make sure that that like one thing that the team understands, right? The CLI that you're using, right? Like understands the utilities. So then when you run the scripts, right? The utility scripts. But one important thing is like, it doesn't matter what package management you're using. When you have a dependency that you're pulling, make sure always that that dependency is reliable. There's been a lot of hacks lately and in the last few years where one dependency, because it's open source, gets compromised, not because open source is bad, because sometimes one malintention, a user with a bad intention contributed, right? And then nobody noticed or something happened, right? It gets compromised, the package, and then all the packages using that gets compromised and get that dependency. Like for example, for mining, right? So the part where I'm going is like every time you install a new package, always open the npm registry, see when it was published, see if it has downloads, see if it has bugs, see if it is like a reliable source, open the author, right? Don't just install whatever people say like, oh, just install this one, right? No, always go and check, do your due diligence and be conscious and aware of what dependencies you pull into your software. So and the npm audit will help, but always you cannot be careful enough. And yeah, that's it really for me. Like the ones I want to cover just in this episode, right? I mean, we can do more episodes. We can talk a lot about this, Jared. Do you have any other practice you want to cover before we finish?
No additional packages. Just want to emphasize that, like Juan was saying, like if you do drive to use strict versioning in your npm packages, that makes it even more important for you as the engineer to be able to maintain those versions and update them as necessary. So using npm audit to be more or outdated, to be aware of which ones need to be updated and resolved. And also, yeah, making sure you do your research on the packages that you're installing, right? There's like lots of packages out there that have, huge support and lots of downloads, right? And those are pretty reliable. But if you're using something more obscure, it's perhaps worth looking a little bit more carefully at, because you are installing relatively arbitrary software onto your computer.
It's like you're giving the keys to your computer to someone else to run the code they want. So always do your due diligence. And yeah, like really that covers it. I mean, there's so many things we could talk about these with package management. It's a very exciting topic, but yeah, something very important. Yeah, never install latest packages, right? I mentioned that before, but I like to emphasize that never use the latest. Don't upgrade your versions every 2 weeks. Like, I'm going to install upgrade versions every 2 weeks. I'm going to upgrade to latest version, because that doesn't really work well for the enterprise, right? Because we have other things to do. So keep that in mind, right? Don't get over excited, and that's really it. I mean, that's like no latest, lock to a version, maintain them, right? Upgrade every 6 months, or depending, stick to long-term versioning, right? Use an upgraded version of Node, right? A current LTS version, stuff like that. But yeah, perfect. So let's do our recap, Jared. Like best practices for package management, right? So in our recap, we talked about pick a package manager, Npm, Yarn, or other, right? Make sure you are locking dependencies through a package.log or a yarn.log. Just check into version control, one or the other. Don't check in your non-modules folder in version control. Make sure you have a package.json manifest in your project. Make sure you use the scripts section, right? Make sure you differentiate between production and development scripts, right? Make sure that you don't have global dependencies, that everything is in your package.json. Limit global or don't use global at all. Like I usually never use global for anything. I always leave local to the project I need. It's pretty easy to do that, except for Npm and Yarn. Those are my only global packages that I have. Log to a specific version, even remove the little tilde, remove everything, just keep the exact number or use -- exact. Use npm audit, right? Use npm outdated. Make sure who published, who's the author, is this reliable, right? It's open source, so you need to be careful still. Open source is great, but sometimes there's bad users that have bad intentions. That's how hacks happen. What else, Jared? What else, like from the recap? Did I miss anything?
I think you're pretty thorough there.
Okay, awesome. So yeah, that's it. So thank you for joining us in this episode 11 of Dev Bootcamp Live, the podcast where we help you level up to become the best engineer or to land your first engineering job. This is Juan Lizarazo.
And this is Jared Potter.
Thank you so much, and we will see you next week.
See you later.